Okay, good evening. I want to talk a little bit about Nolan charts, and I'm introducing myself here with just a picture of me giving a talk in Minnesota in 2002, shortly after 9/11, about personal liberty in that world at the Unitarian Fellowship in a suburb of Minneapolis. That's just a historical picture of mine. But let's go on. I want to talk a little bit about Nolan charts. And so I'll bring up the vanilla chart. Remember that a Nolan chart typically balances personal liberty or social liberty against economic liberty. And then the whole idea is that libertarianism maximizes both, whereas conservatism tends to maximize economic liberty. Liberalism, as we understand it in the left, used to optimize personal and social liberty, and then totalitarianism or authoritarianism of some kind doesn't. And in the middle, you had centrist policies. And so the left and the right were kind of on a diagonal at opposite ends from the top left corner to the bottom right. Totalitarianism was the bottom, and then the other axis was the kind of government that you had, ranging from very little government to a centrist government like we have, all the way down to totalitarianism. But I think a lot of things are going on today with the fact that tech companies are almost like a second kind of government that are very sensitive to the effect of essentially mobs on social media, particularly Twitter, that I think we have to look at more complicated, more sophisticated models. Now, you can more or less have the same kind of idea with a square, with the left and the right and corners and so forth, but it's actually a little better to portray it to make it look like a diamond and tilt it a little bit. So you have the left, which is commonly what we think of as the left today, the Democratic Party, and then the extremes of it on the left side, and then the right, which is we think of the Republican Party and more, and the extreme, sometimes the extreme right, sometimes the libertarian right on the right side. Then on the vertical axis, we go from as little government as possible, in other words, anarchy almost, down to totalitarianism at the bottom. And then that's kind of an interesting run through, because we talk about anarchy, and then and then we come to libertarianism in the sense of having as little regulation of either personal behavior or economic behavior as possible. Then classical liberalism, which basically emphasizes the government should not emphasize the kinds of opinions people want to have. People should be able to make up their own minds of religion and philosophy and ethics and so forth within the framework of a stable society. Then we get into the forms of government. A republic is considered to have more liberty than a democracy in this format. But then you go down to monarchy, like in Europe throughout most of history, and in other, in the Bible and so forth, and many religions and so forth. Then you keep going down to fascism and to totalitarianism. Sometimes totalitarianism is associated with populism, but we'll get back to that. And then along in other parts of this area, you have, for example, basic capitalism. Then you have forms of conservatism, what we think of as modern conservatism, neoconservatism. That's actually neoconservatism there. It isn't real clear. Neoconservatism, which is mostly concerned with foreign policy, cracking down on dictatorship or extremism overseas, down to paleoconservatism, which is more based on religion and faith, more like the religious right. And then you migrate over into nationalism, and to the idea that you belong to a stronger nation or a stronger ethnicity, so you have to be loyal to that. And that sort of gets you down toward on the right side, down toward in the danger of things like Nazism or Putinism or Stalinism, whether Putin is more like on the right or on the left is kind of up for debate, because in some ways Putin is kind of like Stalin, Vladimir Putin. Fascism and then outright totalitarianism, which are practically the same thing. On the left side, we get into modern liberalism, then to socialism. I should have put democratic socialism on here. And by the way, this chart, originally this chart came from a site called a video called Secrets of Longevity in 2013. So I just thought I would mention that. But getting back to this, and I have to blow it up again. What you find when you get to issues of speech, it gets very interesting, because there's a basic problem that the idea that there's a divide between personal liberty and economic liberty doesn't work as well in the age of the internet. Speech, for example, freedom of speech is both an economic liberty and a personal liberty, but it's probably more an economic liberty in a world where tech companies have so much power, and where tech companies are so responsive to left-wing mobs, particularly, well, mobs, but they're more responsive to the left, and they've gone overboard, they've bent over backwards sometimes on issues, for example, gender theory and to some extent critical race theory, and being in sometimes cracking down on people who are overly conservative or overly critical of those groups, because those people are presumed to be harassing members of protected classes, the idea of a protected class. And so then you get into the idea, that the topology of this chart is a little bit not quite sufficient. You need to actually add other dimensions, or you could add strings or loops like in string theory to cover the speech issue. For example, in modern conservatism, you would typically support personal agency as much as possible, individualism as much as possible, particularly on the libertarian or neoconservative side. But on the religious side of personal agency, you would say that personal agency, particularly the ability to take one's speech and have a lot of influence over society because of either search engines or asymmetry or algorithms on others, that ought to be balanced by having responsibility for others who are less fortunate or less independent than you are, let's say less independent. The best way to do that and keep your own personal agency is to follow the rules. Don't have sex until you get married, and then get married and have children, and have sort of to pass traditions along and kind of have your own little power base through your family. But of course that can be abused. That can turn into patriarchy, or that can turn into, you can start to become neglectful of people who are less fortunate and not spread out and help them as much as you should. You could slide down into nationalism, for example, or ethno-nationalism, or religiosity, religious fundamentalism, either radical Islam or radical Christianity. On the left side, it strikes me that agency itself is less personal, is more communal. There is more emphasis on making sure that the individual is always, when they do anything, they're always helping to advance the causes of other people who are maybe more oppressed than they are, even to the point that you don't encourage people to excel in school without help bringing other people up. But it's a much more communal effort. So instead of emphasizing individualism through the family, which is something the right believes in, that you buttress your individualism through having a family and raising children yourself and bringing them up well and everything. It's more belonging to a group, being willing to go to bat for people, for oppressed groups, accepting the fact that your own humility, your own vulnerability, that you might belong to one of these groups, and having allyship with other groups. So that's much more of a communal experience. So you kind of need to have these kind of loops that are like in string theory to express this problem about freedom of speech, how it really works, because it kind of has some paradoxes in it because of the way corporations behave and the way they react to the mob and everything. And even the way personal agency is thought of. It's, again, a little bit more like a loop in this diagram that would go into a kind of other kind of topology. Maybe the loop is a Mobius strip. Maybe it is. That's a good question. There are other models that have 3 dimensions to this Nolan chart and for governments and societal structures and so forth. But this is my take of it today.